I'm Peter Kurti, Visiting Fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies in the Religion and Free Society programme. Our guest at CIS this afternoon is Daniel Pipes, the President of the Middle East Forum, who is on a speaking tour of Australia and has found time to come to CIS. Daniel Pipes, a warm welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies.
Thank you.
Historically, anti-Semitism has been a Christian phenomenon. Do you think that the nature of the phenomenon has changed or is changing in recent years?
I do believe it is changed. That in the aftermath of World War II, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there was a profound renunciation of anti-Semitism in the Christian world. There are still obviously the odd characters at the extremes, but as a mainstream phenomenon, it is defunct. In contrast, the phenomenon has moved to the Muslim world, where it is widespread and indeed mainstream. Many governments promote it, intellectuals, religious leaders, and so there's been a fundamental shift from the Christian base to a Muslim base in the last 70 years or so.
Since the founding of Israel in 1948, it seems that that this historical hatred of the Jews has sort of evolved or morphed into a hatred of the Jewish state. To what extent do you think anti-Zionism is a veil for anti-Semitism today?
Indeed, that is another important change. And the third important change might be the shift from the right to the left. There is obviously a legitimate critique of the state of Israel, its policies. I indeed myself criticize Israel. But there's also an obsessive focus on Israel, which leads one to wonder. Why is the Security Council obsessed with Israel? Why are other international organizations, why are newspaper editors and television producers and far-left organizations, why are they focused on Israel? And Israel's clearly one of the less maligned states in the world. If you're going to get obsessed with evil in the world, surely Israel is one of the last places you would be obsessed with. So there's something going on there, and I think there is an element of anti-Semitism, yes.
Is there a difference in the kind of anti-Semitism that is expressed by people on the left from that expressed by people on the right of politics?
Yes. On the right, anti-Semitism tends to be raw, crude, racial in nature. And on the left, it's more disguised. I mean, compare Hitler with Stalin. Hitler was absolutely clear in his anti-Semitism. Stalin was more cautious in it. And in general, the left is more cautious. That said, I think anti-Semitism is far more prevalent today on the left than on the right. It is left-wing organizations that are going after Israel. It is left-wing organizations that are boycotting Jews and Israelis, not on the right.
One of the difficult issues, I think, for Australia, as we come to terms here with the boycott, divestment and sanctions program being implemented here, is that there is a line that seems to be crossed between freedom of expression and the expression of anti-Semitic views. So I think my question is, to what extent, how careful must a society be in drawing a line between the right to freedom of expression, freedom of protest, and preventing vilification of any group in society, of any segment of society, but in this instance, the Jewish community?
Well, as an American and someone who was raised in the First Amendment, I don't see that as a problem. In other words, vilification takes place. It's unpleasant. One assumes that there will be countervailing forces to it, and one doesn't have to resort to law. One doesn't have to prevent it. And so we allow it. We denounce it, but it's not a legal problem. One is allowed to be unpleasant, be biased, be racially insensitive. One can do that. And I think that makes life easier, because as soon as you bring the law in and start telling people what they may say and may not say, it gets very dicey and it becomes political.
So if in the United States anti-Semitism, or the utterance of anti-Semitic views is not illegal, how can the problem, to what extent is anti-Semitism a challenge for American society?
It exists, to be sure, and there different levels of it, mild or social, not wanting certain people in one's club or one's law firm or so, and the more virulent forms which can lead to violence. But by and large, American Jewry has been has not had the kind of problems that Jewish communities have had in other countries, in particular in Europe. So I think this formulation works. And more broadly, allowing people to be vile has been a success in the United States. We do not try and stop freedom of speech. Now, there are exceptions, to be sure. There are gray areas and the like. But the fundamental notion that you're free to express your views, and in particular to express views which are obnoxious to others. We're not talking about nursery tales. We're talking about obnoxious views. It works. And when I look at Europe and see, for example, the ban on anti-Semitism, I see something that doesn't work.
It's certainly true that it becomes much harder to police, whether in Germany or Sweden or Britain. It does seem that that presents a real problem.
What exactly constitutes an illegal statement? What is the sort of punishment? And what do you do today with the internet where one can be anonymous? I just don't think it's a worthwhile endeavor. The motives may be good, but the application is deficient.
It's a problem for Australia at the moment because the Victorian government has referred the boycott to an independent commission because there's a fear that it may have broken the law for trade reasons. But that has brought a denunciation from BDS about the quelling of freedom of expression. So if anti-Semitism is on the rise in Australia, as a number of commentators think it is, what are the implications for our society? It seems to me that one of them might be to relax a bit.
Well, throughout the West, anti-Semitism is on the rise because Muslim populations are on the rise. And everything from anti-Semitic statements to murders are generally attributable to Muslims. And so this is a new factor and a new problem. And it is something that needs to be considered in everything from immigration policy to police community practices. But it is focused in a very small percentage of the population, and by and large an immigrant population. So it raises delicate issues.
Do you think that for an indigenous community, an indigenous Muslim community, education is a significant means of countering anti-Semitic tendencies?
Education, and also making clear that this is unacceptable, that this is socially, politically unacceptable. Not threatening people to put them in jail, but to repudiate this clearly and unequivocally. And that one does not see in places like Europe, where in general the left opens the door to the Muslim anti-Semitism and colludes with it.
How would you respond to the charge, which one does hear from quite often, that Israel brings these problems upon itself in virtue of its government policy, its domestic and foreign policy?
Well, again, referring to Europe, what one finds in Europe is a general renunciation of force. And Israel uses force and must use force because it's being attacked. And so Israel is demonized as a violent country. And so, for that matter, as the United States. There was a poll some years ago, 2003, in which Europeans in a number of countries were asked what are the most dangerous countries in the world. And Israel came first, and then Iran and North Korea, and then the United States. So that's an important aspect to the demonization of Israel and of Israelis, and by extension of Jews. I think it touches something profound in Europe. I don't think it's in Australia. It's a major problem, this notion that you must never use force. Israel is surrounded by enemies who use many different forms of assault, who engage in many different forms of assault, from weapons of mass destruction to conventional armies to terrorism to economic boycott to demographic preponderance to ideological delegitimization. And the Israelis at times must respond with force. When they get attacked, they must respond. In Europe in particular, but on the left more broadly, one finds a horror of this, that somehow it's fine for Palestinians or others to engage in force because they're not really Westerners and they're not subject to the same standards, but Israelis being Westerners, they're forbidden from using force. Well, this doesn't work. You must apply the same standards. If force is prohibited, it must be prohibited on both sides. You can't just tell the Israelis they can't respond with force.
Israel is the only democratic state in the region and works in its own way to protect the rights of its citizenry. Do you think it's important for countries like Australia to continue to give international support for Australia, even in the face of policies that the Israeli government executes that are perhaps uncomfortable or challenging?
There will certainly be times that the government of Australia will disagree with the government of Israel's policies. But then again, which state does the government of Australia not disagree with at some point? The more important factor is that there is a premise of shared values, and that we can disagree on specifics here and there, but there's something fundamentally in common. And that does exist. Israel is a modern, liberal, rule of law state in which the values are very similar to those in Australia. Whereas the enemies of Israel, say the Hamas-governed Gaza Strip, or Syria under Bashar al-Assad, or Iran under Ali Khamenei, these are states which have very, very little in common with Australia.
Daniel Pipes, thank you very much indeed.